My name is Kenneth Vaughan. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology, Gerontology, and Substance Abuse Studies here at the University of Central Oklahoma. I'm fresh off a 3-year non-tenure track stint at the University of Connecticut, and I'm in Oklahoma, and I'm really grateful to spend some time with colleagues today talking about my research. So I got kind of some conflicting advice about how to do this. So I'm going to meet kind of in the middle of the two perspectives I've heard and hope that it's agreeable. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of my broad scope and how I've been doing research over the past couple of years and how this led me to where I am. And I'll share you a sample of some findings I have from a study that I'm involved with right now. It was, I'm mostly involved in political sociology and the sociology of religion. Sociology of religion is what is on my doctorate. And primarily, I'm involved in kind of global research. So for me, sociology has been a tool to learn about communities that I've not previously been aware of. So I'm interested in, I've been doing research on like refugees and attitudes toward refugees, how religion and secularization changes our attitudes toward incoming refugees, mostly focusing on Europe. I've done a lot of research on religion in China. I've done research on religious discrimination in multiple parts of the world. I've done research on a little bit of religion and race in the United States and experience of Islamophobia. These are all kind of topics I've been exploring the last couple of years. I'm also very interested in what we call like democratic deconsolidation and the far right social movements. And again, I'm usually looking for the religion angles with all of these stories. What I had not explored, I was always asked to. I'm a Mexican American myself. And so when I was in graduate school and earlier career, people would always send me opportunities, you know, hey, here's when I was in grad school, here's a job, they're looking for a specialist in Latinx studies. Or they would send me a grant. Hey, here's somebody who's looking to fund research in the study of Hispanic populations. You must be interested in it, right? And up to that time, I actually hadn't done a lot of research in that area because it was so full circle. So in my studies of kind of the global far right, I had been studying Europe was kind of parts of Europe were kind of ahead of the curve here in terms of using their democratic privileges to vote for kind of far right candidates with those kind of characteristics. And so I would always end my studies by saying, and we need to see like how this is migrating to the United States. And so I had kept an eye on it. And we've kind of seen a surge in alt-right activity in the US. I've been just kind of monitoring who's voting which way. And something kind of curious had happened, right? That it's been moderate at the national scale, but looking at the share of Republican voters, it's never going to be to the decimal point the same year by year, as you can see in the left-hand chart that someone else titled Latino loyalty. That's certainly not the term I would use, but they're looking at the share voting Democrat, Republican, or otherwise. And okay, you see a little bit of a drop from 2012 to 2016 at the end, and upwards through 2020, kind of election after election. That pattern has continued. Now, Democrats certainly still maintain a solid majority of the Hispanic or Latinx vote, but it's kind of curious to see Republicans make gains in the years that they did. Research has been really, really clear that for most of the 20th century, especially the later 20th century, I think it might have a delay, or anyway, much of the later 20th century, Hispanics were, both parties were competitive for the Hispanic votes. And it starts to consolidate around the Democratic Party as the Republican Party adopts immigration restrictions that, if you look at statistics, most of us, or a significant proportion of us, are personally affected by that. Like, while myself, I was not undocumented, I'm not an immigrant. I have had family who were immigrants to the US and who were undocumented and who have gotten in legal trouble, right? Like, that is very common to us. So it's widely agreed upon that that's where kind of rejection of the Republican Party platform came from. So it was very curious to see these, albeit modest gains, happening twice across both of Trump's campaigns when he launched his campaign on immigration restrictions. But this is, the national picture can kind of obscure things, right? Because we actually see that there have been uneven gains across counties. So for example, Starr County in not in San Antonio, I'm from San Antonio. Starr County in Texas is the most heavily populated by Hispanic district or county in the country. It is over 95% Hispanic. Hillary Clinton won this district by 65%. Joe Biden won this district by 5%. So it went over the course of 4 years to being overwhelmingly Democratic, to being almost neck and neck between Democrats and Republicans in one election cycle. That is absolutely unheard of. You have similar gains in places like Webb, Texas, 28% gains. In Maverick, Texas, 46% gains. There are other pockets in Atlanta, in Georgia, in Florida, and elsewhere. Anyway, right? Like based on what we understand about how Latinx voters vote, this was very surprising. So what's going on here? There's a lot of published research. One of the kind of common field manuals is Gerardo Guedaba's book, The Hispanic Republican, and people pass out a lot of kind of like essentialist arguments that frankly have always kind of not resonated very well with me. So there's kind of these broad ideas of like, hey, well, you know, there's Latinos are hard workers, right? Which almost kind of taps into stereotypes, but you'll see this come up in the literature. And so, you know, maybe Republican rhetoric about bootstraps and the Protestant ethic and stuff, even though we're mostly Catholic, would tap into this. More on that later. You know, Hispanics, they tend to be very oriented around family values. Maybe they like that rhetoric. Maybe there are divides within immigration status. So this came up in the last couple of years, mostly in popular journalism, that there was supposedly kind of this infighting and that some Hispanics were adopting the rhetoric of, well, you know, we came here fairly, and so that immigration, undocumented migration makes us angry. That didn't strike me right, and so I'm investigating that as a part of this study. But it comes up in the literature, so I feel the need to address it. Some of it has been group position. So maybe then people propose, and there's evidence of this in previous elections, that if you know the Republican Party has a candidate who's going to be going hard against things like affirmative action, against other programs to kind of help minority group members, that sometimes a campaign that will kind of pit Black and Hispanic voters against each other can be reasonably effective. We've seen this in Texas. We've seen this play out in terms of resettling IDPs after Katrina in San Antonio. This also came up in research on gang activity in somewhere in California. So there's evidence of this at some points. There's also the question of so-called whitening, right? And so Hispanic is kind of an ambiguous identity. Like if you poll Hispanic and Latino voters on how we consider ourselves, we're kind of unsure if we consider it a race or an ethnicity. Legally and in most sociological discourse, we would be considered an ethnicity that is highly racialized. And so there is room for kind of changing your identity. And there's been some recent research that shows, well, some of this vote switching has happened among people who were previously identifying as Hispanic, but in the next census or in the next general social survey, switched their identity to white, something that some of us can pull off more than others, right? Like I solidly identify as Mexican American, but if you see me in the hall, fairly white passing, my name is Kenneth Vaughan, right? Like I could do that. And voters that did decide to do that were disproportionately more likely to switch their votes. So maybe there's some evidence there. As a sociologist of religion, my ears perk up when I hear what's called the religious factor come up, okay? So people have talked and have made much about the proportion of Hispanics who are Roman Catholic, for example. And it is true that there's been a large number of Hispanics who have left the Roman Catholic Church over the last couple of years, but where do they usually go? Yes, some do, you know, secularize and become irreligious of one way or another, but many are going to Pentecostal traditions and are going to Baptist traditions, and they are given, they may adopt certain kind of conservative social views there. The main one that comes up is being pro-life or in favor of abortion restrictions, against the pro-choice movement. Others, you know, bring up ideas about sexuality and back to the family values. So this is what's in the literature. Now, there is this kind of centering, and this is why I bring up my background, because I was immediately skeptical. There's this centering in the sociology of religion around what people have called the God gap, and we hear this a lot in popular discourse. This is an idea that kind of essentializes religiosity with conservative politics. And I'm sure most of us here, even if we don't study religion extensively, are probably familiar with kind of popular statistics about like evangelical votes. We're probably all familiar with what the religious right is, especially living in the Bible Belt. And so this kind of becomes essentialized in media discourse and in academic discourse to, let me make sure I can just see. Okay, yeah, if there's any problems with audio, let me know, or chat by chat or anything. I was just checking on that. So this idea, the God gap, becomes essentialized in popular discourse and some academic discourse on religion in general, right? So like religion is being seen as this kind of essentially conservatizing force. So that's where this argument for Hispanics come from, right? Well, Hispanics are, generally more religious than white people in this country, for example. So maybe that's where some of like conservative influences are coming from, right? After all, evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Trump. The problem is, well, there are a lot of problems with this, right? So, I mean, in my work on refugees, for example, I'll see that in 10 different countries, it's like religious people who are the most welcoming of refugees. And then in 10 different countries, it's secular people who are the most welcoming of refugees. In my research on religion and race in the United States, there is a world of difference in terms of like social preferences and policy preferences in a predominantly white evangelical church, a predominantly multiracial, or not predominant, a multiracial evangelical church, and a predominantly Black evangelical church, right? So already just kind of based on my background, when I'm hearing this being floated, just, oh, it's clearly, all these Catholics and Pentecostals, I'm like, well, those are very diverse traditions. Within both of those alone, you have literally everything running from Marxist liberation theology to like the hardcore religious right. So that doesn't tell me something immediately. So this is kind of the loudest story, right? It's like, well, like religion then is clearly politically conservative, right? And then, that's kind of, well, I don't know, do you want to say Jews are conservative overall? Do you want to say Muslims are overall? And then kind of clap back. Okay, sorry, Christianity is then what's politically conservative, and that's the majority religion for Hispanics, right? Okay, well, there's some diversity there too. Okay, is it white Christians then? Well, okay, evangelicals, white evangelicals don't vote the same way as white Episcopalians, right? Where it's like every Episcopalian church you'll drive by will have a Black Lives Matter banner and a LGBT affirming theology flag, in the front, right? And that's very different than your traditional kind of Southern Baptist church at every street corner here in Oklahoma. And this also varies regionally, right? Like every church in my neighborhood in Connecticut was of more of the Episcopal variety. And then here there's like, 5 kind of conservative Baptist churches just in my neighborhood. And so, okay, maybe it's white evangelicalism and political conservatism, possibly. And that at this point in history, that picture does line up. White evangelicals vote overwhelmingly Republican. This is where a lot of the centering of the sociology of religion was, which I have complaints about, but the numbers add up. But most Hispanics don't identify as white or evangelical. So what's that got to do with us or with them? Because I wasn't a Trump voter, but I am Hispanic. So this background knowledge is the fact that it's messy and all over the board is the point. I've got something in chat. Oh, do you know what? That's a great question. Do you know what percentage of Latino Hispanic voters identify as other, specifically mestizo instead of white? So mestizo doesn't come up in much of the polling research. So we don't really have specific numbers on that, nor are there any questions that are there commonly questions that tap into our indigenous heritage. About 11% of us will say that being Hispanic is only a racial identity. About 66% of us will say it's both racial and ethnic. So we will typically accept ourselves as Hispanic and something else, which is typically white in this country, but it can also be Black for Afro Latinas and also Asian Latinas as well. And so it's about 67% who see us at least as some sort of a racial minority. It's going to be a smaller proportion of us, maybe like 20 to 30 max, who would say that we're just white, but Hispanic is an ethnicity. Often when we do that, we just switch and say, I used to call myself Hispanic, but now I'm white, and this is ambiguous as well. It's a great question. So here's some of our religious background stuff, right? And again, you don't need to memorize all this to understand the research that's coming up, but even evangelicalism itself, right? But Robert Wuthnow has Princeton University has this great book where he covers this, and it's like, it's kind of been all over the place, right? Evangelicalism emerges as this story of like, let's just engage, because the fundamentalists who they broke off from, they were retreatists, right? It's like, don't send our kids to school because they're going to learn like evolution and Big Bang cosmology there. Don't dance, don't go to the movies, right? Evangelicals come out and say, well, that's like, but the interesting about fundamentalists is they used to say, don't vote, right? Because politics is worldly and it's sinful. We'll build Bible societies and intentional communities. And we have a conservative ethic here, but like, we don't like anyone in politics, generally speaking. Ideal types rarely exist. Evangelicals break out and say, well, let's be engaged. Like, we believe we should vote. We believe that we should go to school board meetings, right? We believe that we should make movies, and every now and again they'll be good. We believe that we should make music and play instruments, right? Like we want to engage the culture, and potentially the rhetoric they will use is lead the culture. So they're kind of just starting out as present, which kind of, it just aggregates toward the mean in the center. They have a brief leftward turn with Jimmy Carter, who's like the first person, one of the first major candidates running as born again evangelical. And then they're kind of swayed by the religious right afterwards, and they've kind of steadily been there ever since. They're split on individual issues though. So they tend to skew conservative, but on things like social safety nets, they actually tend to be a little bit more supportive than like others in the conservative bases. But that differs from election to election. Similarly, like the evangelical God gap, like it was closing for a while, where in 2008, even white evangelicals were more diverse than they had ever been in terms of politics. And then it kind of bursts open, and it starts to spread again in 2012, kind of bursts open with the 2016 election, where among voters, something like, I think it was like 72 or 81% had voted for Trump, which was not surprising to me, but it was surprising to a lot of sociologists. It wasn't surprising to me that they voted Republican the 40-something year in a row. What do religious groups vote on? That can be very different, right? Conservative Protestants tend to vote on what are labeled family issues, right? They vote a lot on like sexual ethics, ideas about like divorce and marriage, and of course, as is highly salient right now, reproductive rights and restrictions. We see effects of religiosity, meaning like how you practice is really kind of diverse. So there was like a groundbreaking study by Aaron Franzen a few years ago, and he found that among several traditions, like the more people read their sacred texts, including Christians, what tends to happen is they tend to grow very politically liberal, which might be surprising under this God gap framework, but they also tend to grow kind of culturally conservative at the same time. That sounds weird in the United States, but actually globally, those two things are very tightly correlated. That, you know, you go to many other countries, especially outside the West, go into the majority world, and it's like people have, if they have really conservative views on family, then they're going to want a tight social safety net to protect families, right? If they have, the family ethic kind of goes alongside an egalitarian one. I am getting an unstable connection warning, so just let me know if I need to do anything about that. Catholics have historically voted on class issues, which can go left and right, depending. The LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they prefer you say that out loud when you refer to them, but they're often called Mormon. And their churches they have a very strong reputation for being conservative. They're also they have a very high white presence in this country that can be diverse globally though. And they're very conservative, but what's interesting is when they go on missions and kind of see the rest of the world, they tend to come home and have and adopt a more liberal position on immigration, right? So this is a kind of common story in American politics where people don't align closely with one party or another. And so even if religious groups skew one way, they can have different preferences by political issue from one issue to another. We see that religion is associated with different political outcomes based on the race of the person, their class status, their gender, what religion they belong to, right? Christians, Muslims, and Jews don't vote all in the same way, but neither do Episcopalians and white evangelicals. And depending on how religious somebody is, that might change their levels of commitment too. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's not a single story. I don't like to spend in teaching much time reading off slides, so I promise to only do it once today. But I think like the problem is here, right? Like where we get this kind of conservative God gap argument. Grace Yukich and Penny Edgell called this out in their great edited volume called Religion is Race. They said, what we're doing here is privileging the white evangelical account of religion in one country and building a whole theory of that. And they say, by privileging white evangelical accounts of religion, we not only miss the great variety of religiosity that exists, but we also contribute to the dominance of whiteness in a certain way of being religious. We also obscure the fact that white evangelical religiosity is socially and historically constructed, as variable and contested as any religious tradition, lending it an aura of superiority that can foster exclusion of those from other religions as well as the non-religious, or religious traditions as well as the non-religious. I would add, or racial minorities within those conditions. Finally, we perpetuate understandings of religion that by privileging individuals' freely and rationally chosen beliefs, ignore how a society's religious forms are foundationally shaped by the society, including how it imagines and structures race. So this is on the one hand, a kind of easy pill to swallow in the sociology of religion, right? We don't like centering whiteness, and we would be upset, right, if we were to see, you know, leaders in white evangelical congregations kind of say to the rest of America, the majority of America, our way of doing religion is the only way, right? That would probably offend our sensibilities as sociologists who value diversity and justice. But what Edgell and Ukich and Edgell point out is by kind of obsessively researching and building from this group, we're actually contributing to their dominance too. And we need a slice of proverbial humble pie for that. So they go on to tell us that religion is raced, and stats can be really messy, right? And so when you do find a statistical relationship between religion and political conservatism in the United States, that tends to be buffered. It goes in the opposite direction or slows down when you introduce racial minority status into that. Let's see. We all know that white evangelicals have more conservative policy preferences than non-evangelicals, at least when we're looking at whites. But this can kind of break apart when you look at other racial groups. So, for example, within African-American communities, African-American evangelicals actually have slightly more progressive policy preferences than African-Americans who are part of other traditions. So what's the most conservative in a white setting is not the most conservative in a predominantly African-American setting. There are even stark differences on racial politics and abortion, right? So like white evangelicals in the United States, they tend to be they have the highest individualistic explanations for racism, for inequality. So they will be the most likely to say, racism or racial inequality exists because some groups are more motivated to succeed than others, while that's the total opposite for Black evangelicals, right? They will say that racial inequality exists because of structural inequality. It's either a large minority or a slight majority. It depends on the poll, but you'll see a large group of Black evangelicals who will support abortion rights. And I think from everything we've probably heard about white evangelicals, that mostly adds up. That is not true of white evangelicals. It's the polar opposite, right? This is an example that religion can be raced. The Black Protestant tradition denominational leanings tend to be politically liberal, right? This is a kind of a seat of activism. Martin Luther King's leading the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Sojourner Truth, another activist who had previously been enslaved, right? She sees herself as a prophet. So does Harriet Tubman, right? There's a constant intersection here. Now, there are a lot of great Black secularist leaders too who get completely ignored by history. So I don't want to say that any religion, that Christianity or anyone else has a monopoly on this, but I'm comparing them to white Christians, not to Black secularists, right? Sandra Barnes has this great study. It's been replicated and revisited multiple times on Black culture and action within the Black church. Again, this is kind of more of a social justice mobilization. We see that Asian American voting patterns, these also tend to diverge very strongly from the white dominant group and also by religion. So Wong et al., they rejected the God gap theory in one of their studies. Jung et al. In one of the chapters in Religion is Race, they revisit this. So they find the only thing we can really say about Asian Americans is that religiosity is associated with political engagement. It doesn't necessarily tell you how. While white evangelicals, again, the most conservative, one of the largest voting blocs in the general election for Donald Trump, wasn't true in the primaries, the Republican primaries, which is interesting, but in both general elections, that's obviously the case. And yet, Asian American evangelicals, not only are they more liberal than white evangelicals, but they tend to be more liberal than whites in general. They are more conservative than some other Asian groups, though, right? So like Trump wins 70–80% of the white evangelical vote. He only carries 21% of the Asian American evangelical vote, which makes it a clear minority position. And Jung et al. And Wong, they point out that within Asian American and Pacific Islander Republicans, right? Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who say I'm part of the Republican Party, they're more likely in the past couple of years to say that they're very disenfranchised with the party. So not only is the God gap evidence not found here, but that's indicative of a possible trend of even further moving away from that. We also find, this would be unsurprising then, that in general, not just for religious populations, but feeling threatened through racialization experiences, experiencing hate crime, knowing people that having a loved one who's been deported, et cetera, et cetera. This tend to have a liberalizing effect on minority group members. And this is particularly true of religious minority group members who might be rejected in multiple settings, right? And so what about Hispanics then? Well, as I said, much is made of the conservative religious traditions, and it's true. The Roman Catholic Church has officially adopted a position that is restrictive of abortion and upholds conservative views on marriage and things like that, right? That is officially doctrine. But within congregations, there is unpunished dissent on that, and it looks like even our current pope, or I'm not Catholic, their current pope is appointing people who diverge from the church tradition to committees, right? Indicative of possible change. He's popular, right? So like, what does that say about the actual people in the pews? Similarly, Baptists, right? They have a very conservative reputation, especially if you live in a place like Oklahoma, where the major denomination is the Southern Baptist Convention, which is very Southern and conservative. Although even their history is very complicated. If you've followed this, the current discourse has raised the fact that the SBC up until I think about 78, maybe 82, actually supported abortion access. And it was only with a turn toward the religious right that they had gone in the other direction, right? There are still people alive from before that turn who might have internalized that view. And similarly, there are also many moderate and liberal Baptist denominations as well. It's like Central Baptist, American Baptist. The university I went to was affiliated with one of the moderate or liberal denominations, so we had no religious education or anything like that. This again shows what kind of diversity exists. Again, Pentecostals, they tend to be associated with religious conservatism, but their origins at Azusa Street were very diverse and kind of justice oriented. Now, there was a split later on where some had joined more conservative forces on racial issues, and that's where you have Pentecostal, Assembly of God split, and a few other things like this. So you have within these, you do have conservative wings for sure, but you have other ideas as well. Then, of course, there's going to be just a large chunk of people who are politically checked out. Many people, especially in this country, just don't like religion politics mergers, right? So they try to compartmentalize. So we have to keep that in account. We have to account for that as well. There's an argument about Protestant conversion as whitening, right? If being Roman Catholic is kind of stereotyped as the default for Hispanics, then are those who break out of that exploring other ethnic options? That was proposed by Gerardo Marti. He's particularly looking at economic neoliberalism and kind of the Protestant ethic, a very old Weberian argument. I'm not sure. I'm not amenable to that, but I don't have evidence to test it. So the general whitening framework is there. And if we're becoming white, well, whites are more likely to vote for the Republican Party. So maybe that has something to do with it, right? Again, abortion restrictions, so-called traditional family values, put that in quotes on purpose. That's the language that will be used. The God gap, right? We revisit this. And as I said, there are extreme diversities within all of these, right? That again, within the Catholic and Pentecostal tradition, it ranges from the religious right, Jerry Falwell et al., to the liberation theology tradition, which is rooted in Marxism. And you've got everything in between and a lot of interested people. Migrants' rights activism, kind of associated with progressive politics in the United States, sometimes libertarian, but mostly progressive. This is often rooted in Hispanic religious congregations. So in my work on refugees, I found that in the US, we have 9 major organizations that are responsible for resettling refugees. 7 of them are religious, and the largest one is probably Catholic Social Services, led by Hispanic activists. Those who are registered as Republican, among Hispanics, it is higher among evangelicals than other groups, but it peaks at 27%. So we're not finding a majority here, which complicates our narrative. So then, what am I doing? I'm not gonna bore you with stats. I am a number cruncher. I'm sorry, that makes for much less interesting presentation. So I'm not gonna go over my whole sample and everything. I'll just let you know I'm working with the voter study group. I'm working with a sample of Hispanic voters, a representative sample, who were polled on their attitudes. We asked them, or not we, but the survey proctorers, they asked them questions about their religion, about their political preferences, general socio-demographic material questions. And I'm working with that survey, right? It's from September 2020, so about a month and a half out from the 2020 election. They had closer data in November, but only for the vote, not for the other variables I needed. I didn't want it to get messy, so I kept it all within the same time frame. And I've done some comparisons to make sure that it doesn't mess things up, and it really doesn't. So this is part of a larger project where we look at about a dozen different outcomes, but I'm just going to focus on 3 today. How is religion associated with voting for Donald Trump among US Hispanics in our sample of about 500? How does it affect our racial identity? I'll tell you in a moment why I picked that to isolate today. And how does religion influences our ideas for why inequality exists in the United States? Again, I'll talk about why in a moment. So this is the only boring table I'm going to show you today. Please forgive me. These are models 1 and 2 are odd. What that means if the number is larger than 1, it's positive. If the number is smaller than 1, this will be as nitty gritty as it gets, I promise. If the number is smaller than 1, it's negative. And the other ones we're using coefficients. than saying you're an atheist or an agnostic, right? Those are three different categories. I'm happy to answer. The sociology of religion is confusing and weird, and I love talking about it. So please, if anything trips you up, I would love to answer your questions about this later on. And we are comparing these groups only to Catholics, because the argument is this is what happens when when Hispanics change their religion, and the majority religion was Catholicism. So that's who we're comparing it to. So relative to Catholics, more of those who say no religion were voting for Trump if you adjust for everything else, which doesn't necessarily match onto raw statistics. But in terms of Protestants, atheists, agnostics, members of other religions, they all kind of said, once you control for your political views, they all vote relatively similarly. There doesn't seem to be a major religious factor. There is a small effect for subjective religiosity. So those who said, I consider myself a really religious person, were perhaps more likely to vote for Trump, but the effect is weak. And so it's a little unclear how reliable that is. Unsurprisingly, right, GOP support. So the stars will tell you if it's significant, by the way. Conservatism, and I think I dropped them for GOP, but it should be there too. Unsurprisingly, conservatives and Republicans voted for the conservative Republican candidate, right? That makes sense. Notice here, though, that the immigration thesis, right, that like this is documented citizens, right, turning their backs on the undocumented. At least in the first model, that doesn't seem to have a very strong effect. In fact, it's not statistically significant at all. What does, however, have an effect are attitudes toward race. And it should be ethnicity, but that's how it was pulled there. But I run a bunch of robustness tests. They were internalizing that as their Hispanic identity. So those who said like being Hispanic is less about who I am, they were the least likely to vote for Trump, which makes sense, right? Because those who also switched their identity to white were the most likely, we saw in previous research. But similarly, those who were oppositional to Black Lives Matter, they also had much lower levels of support for Trump, which mattered a lot more than things like the machismo thesis is rejected. We ran some other models, and even abortion doesn't stick out too much, right? But like opposition to some of the racial politics that are going on, that seems to have been internalized, which is needs to be discussed. Similarly, Hispanic voters who rejected structural explanations for racism, right? The ones who said that, minorities have lower income and lower rates of education because they're not trying as hard or something, like they would be the most likely to vote for Trump. And that seems to be a particularly salient issue for Hispanic voters. So then looking at this, I said, well, then who then, if your identity matters, well, how does religion affect your identity, right? And here, the religious effects they're robust, but they're also highly variable. So it is true, in line with the kind of whitening thesis, that Protestants, those compared to Catholics, Protestants were less likely, reasonably less likely to say, being an Hispanic is important to who I am. This was also true of atheists, those who said they were none, those of other religions. So what does that tell us? Kind of summarizing this, it does seem that there is a strong kind of centering of Hispanic identity in the Catholic Church, right? There's nothing special about secularizing, probably. There's probably nothing special about being a part of another religion, just that people who leave the church have probably they're spending less time in a Hispanic serving congregation, right? If you're in a Protestant church, it's more likely to be white people around you. Similarly, secular populations in the United States are some of the most white populations in the United States as well. It's probably just telling you something about your surrounding. What's interesting, though, is in general, regardless of who you compare them to, those who say they were more religious have a higher sense of identity tied to being Hispanic. Similarly, those who say that this one's slight, we're not sure, but there's a slight connection between saying you're born again and evangelical. Just want to say, I highly disagree with the survey's decision to put those two as one question, but I got to work with what I got. But there is a slight effect there that they're actually more likely to identify with their Hispanic identity as well. That needs to be untangled. My suspicion is that that's speaking to joining kind of like, if you're driving in a Hispanic neighborhood, you'll see like Iglesia Pentecosto, you'll see Iglesia Batista, right? Like, I think that's probably going to speak to that, but it's not made clear in the data. But finally, right, we see that having attitudes against structural racism, right? Saying, or not against, but saying that structural racism doesn't explain Black inequality in the United States or inequality between whites and Blacks, that does predict the Trump vote. But religion apparently has little to nothing to do with that. None of the religious predictors are significant here. And it affects different groups. I'll show you just a sample of this in different ways. So we are looking at, odds of voting for Trump, right? What's going on with this evangelical effect? That this does appear to vary with frequency of religious service attendance, right? That it's a very weak effect. You notice you're going between 0 and 0.1. But okay, that those who were not the most engaged, they were slightly more likely to vote for Trump than those who were more engaged in their religious services, right? That's true for evangelical and born again. It's not true for virtually any other group, right? Which tells us there's not this broad religious effect if like how you practice your religion is affecting different groups in different ways. That's similarly, right? Oh, sorry, that was the frequency of prayer. This is attendance. Again, this is fairly modest. It's not as modest as the last one. So this is practice, right? Prayer and attendance at church. And we're looking at now, like, who is the most likely to say that inequality is structural, okay? And so there is a slight effect, a negative effect between going to church and saying that like inequality is structural. But the relationship is different for born again and not born again Hispanics, or those who would call themselves born again and evangelical or not born again and evangelical, that there's a buffering effect, that it has less of an effect on the born again and evangelical crowd, which is really interesting, right? Because now we're starting to see, contrary to the God gap, that this might be pushing some kind of progressive ideas about race relations in the United States. Again, not incredibly surprising if you understand the full repertoire of Hispanic religions in the US, but it doesn't fit the data well on the God gap idea. The last one I'll show you, the fact that this is indistinguishable almost is the point, right? Where it's like we were looking at general religiosity, how religious do people say they are? And there's a slight positive relationship there, very slight, that, as they say I'm more religious, they're also more likely to view racial inequality as a structural problem, which is good from a sociological perspective. There's, at low levels of religiosity, there's a mild, teeny tiny gap between Protestants and Catholics, with Catholics being more willing to recognize that as a social fact, which is something I would acknowledge as a social fact as a sociologist too. But they're essentially neck and neck when you get to high levels of practice, right? So once we're practicing, Protestant and Hispanic Catholics don't look very different in terms of how structured they view inequality to be in US society. And so I know that's a lot of stats and there's a lot of math. I know that people aren't in line with that. It's the most boring thing that I do. So let's kind of go back to the story then, and then we'll finish up. What can we say here? Well, it looks like a simple religious factor can be rejected, right? That sometimes secularization goes in kind of a whitening direction or a conservative direction. Sometimes religiosity does. It just depends on which measures of religiosity we're looking at, which questions we're asking, and which tradition we're in, that you don't have the same story repeating itself, right? Which tells us there's not this general one God gap. We see that Protestant and born again evangelical Hispanic Christians, born again and evangelical can apply to any group. In fact, it's gotten interesting. We're like, even something like 5% of Muslims and 15% of Buddhists like the word evangelical, as Ryan Burge's research has shown, which is really interesting. But Protestants and non-Protestant, Catholic and non-Catholic Christians among Hispanics, sometimes they come together, as we just saw here, right? And in some areas they diverge. And from the classic view, right? Well, this is happening in ways sometimes that fit the whitening thesis, right? Where like Catholics are more supportive of a progressive position than Protestants, but sometimes it reverses, right? That needs to be disentangled in the future. We don't have a great explanation for that, but the current explanations of God gap and whitening don't seem to be working here. Similarly, the effects of secularization, right? If I look at it from one angle, it seems like, as you see with white Americans, right? That like white atheists in the United States is one of the most progressive voting blocks that you can find. In some cases, it's not that stark, but it starts to look like that for Hispanics sometimes. And in other articulations of secularization, it even has a conservatizing effect, right? What's that about? I have hypotheses, but it's not fitting the simple story, right? Of like we go away from we go away from religion and we become more liberal, or toward it and become more conservative. Every single one of these, it's a story of different pathways opening up rather than a simple effect. When we compare multiple models and effect sizes, I find just in terms of other explanations, this intra-immigrant status divide and argument, it doesn't really seem to be motivating much in terms of support for Trump or conservative movements. There is little to no support for this kind of essentialist machismo argument, right? That like, oh, well, and it's interesting, right? Because we recognize it rightfully so as Orientalism when somebody says, oh, well, all Muslims, right, they treat women badly or they treat gay people badly, right? Like, yes, there are problems in Middle Eastern countries, but in the United States, Muslim Americans actually have higher support for LGBT rights than other religious groups do. That's an Orientalist stereotype that we use, right? Well, I would argue that similarly, again, are there Mexican sexists? Sure, there are sexists in every culture, but that like we are swarmed with machismo and we're unable to recognize women's rights like white people are, I think is a stereotyped kind of racist argument. And accordingly, I find no evidence for sexism as a unique motivator among Hispanic voters. I think that we're probably going to zero in on lived experience, that Hispanics who have experienced discrimination, they tend to be, and this has been supported in previous research as well, they tend to be more liberal in their policy preferences and less conservative, and that there is also a religious connection to that too, that certain religious groups are more likely to recognize this. And those are probably those, from the best evidence we have, that are spending time in other Hispanic serving religious congregations where they can kind of trade notes and share experiences of discrimination. I found that was also the case in a study of American Muslims. My most recent publication is on who experiences the most Islamophobia, and similarly, those who goes to the mosque the most often are talking about it and learning about it the most. We do find in kind of this classical set of arguments, the only one that really is supported is in lieu of a strong religious effect, we find that the group threat model, which is a very basic model for predicting hostilities in intergroup relations in the United States or elsewhere too, that does tend to have some support, that the more skeptical Hispanics are of the realities of systemic racism, and the more likely Hispanics are to support or to believe that African Americans have higher rates of poverty and higher rates of unemployment than whites, if they attribute blame to that, that does kind of predict conservative votes in a rather predictable direction. Future directions for research then, there are gaps here. There's lots of gaps too. So I want to disentangle more about religious effects from religious traditions, right? Even within Protestantism, as I've said before, right? If you are going to, you know, an Episcopalian church that ordains, you know, female clergy, that's a different Protestant experience than going to the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, which refuses to do that. Similarly, if you're going to the Metropolitan Community Church, which is intentionally LGBTIA plus affirming, as opposed to a Southern Baptist congregation, which puts on their statement of faith that on their website that marriage is between one man and one woman, right? That's a very, very different political and social cultural experience for American Protestants of any races, right? So I think we need to disentangle that. One of the things I didn't have time to get into because it opens up a whole can of worms, but like we actually, some of those charts I was showing you were like at different levels of church attendance and frequency of prayer and self-assessed religiosity. Different religious groups look different. That's not surprising. What's interesting is I found some of the same things for those who called themselves atheists, nuns, and agnostics, right? That while in a philosophy class, these might have kind of firm definitional boundaries, in our lived experiences, people don't, right? People go from, yeah, you know, I really, you know, think I had a spiritual experience today, and then 2 weeks later, it's all hokum, and they find themselves in between. And so this kind of, we see a lot of that in relatively secularized groups, and we should look at the lived experience here. We should disentangle. The data didn't make this available, so forgive me for lumping everyone in together, right? But like Mexican voters do not vote the same as Cuban voters, who do not vote the same as Venezuelan voters, right? That like what kind of government you or your ancestors came from will often shape, either you'll be in support of it or you'll wholeheartedly reject it, as happens with many, not all, it's overstated, Cuban and Venezuelan Americans, right? We don't vote the same, that's very clear. We should also use longitudinal research to explore voter changes. So actually the voter study group will allow me to do that in the next step of our research. And of course, we should use qualitative research to supplement this and find richer detail. Yeah, I'm curious what questions, what discussion points do we have? I'm aware that I talk way too fast, and so if you need me to repeat anything, that's okay as well. And thank you for bearing with me. When I teach, I don't normally monologue this long, so I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, and I see we have a question already in the chat. Is there one nationality that votes more conservative than others?
Yeah, so this has notably been true of Cuban Americans. There is a selection effect there, right? That if you're coming to the United States from Cuba and you're willing to risk your life to do that, as often is the case, you probably, not always, but you probably have like a reason for doing that, and you don't like the type of government you have back home. And so when you come to the United States and you have one party, usually the Republican Party, who is more willing to kind of take a hawkish approach on Cuba, and also just kind of repeatedly denouncing communism. Now, Democrats are not communists either, but Republicans talk about it a lot more. That appeals to them. We have also seen this with recent waves of Nicaraguan immigrants in the 1990s, who were actually sought by the Republican Party, because the more refugees you have, the more it highlights a human rights situation over there. And so that was the case too. And also with current Venezuelan refugees. Again, I have a friend who studies Venezuela, right? I'm not making an argument about what the government is like there. But if you have made the journey to the United States from there and left your job, your family, et cetera, behind, you probably like our kind of more market-based economy more than you like the Chavismo Maduro model. So those are the two those are the three that tend to stand out. But it differs by immigration waves too. If we have a flood of Nicaraguan immigrants from a different government in 20 years, they won't vote the same probably. That's a great question. Oh, I think Brett, Dr. Sharp.
Thanks, Dr. Vaughan. Do you go by Ken or Kenneth or Kenny or?
Oh, I go by Ken and Kenneth, yeah.
All right. So I'm in political science, and I had to step out for a minute, so I may have missed it. But there was a survey, I think last year, that Pew Research Center had released, which showed that people who identified as evangelicals were just conflating that with being Trump supporters. What's your take on that?
I was resistant to that for a long time, and I'm fully on board now. I think the evidence is overwhelming. Ryan Burge, you may know him. He's a political scientist who shares a lot of data on religion as well. Proof is for logic and math, right? We don't say it, but as comfortable as I am saying that we have really strong evidence here. One of the things we can do in our stats is look at effect sizes. And we find that if you identify as evangelical, Republican affiliation is a stronger predictor of that than church attendance. And so it does seem to have become a political variable. There's kind of a feedback loop there, right? That evangelical meant something really specific and theological in the day of Luther. But by today, if you ever hear evangelical in the news, what's it talking about, right? It's talking about Republican voters. And so you may adopt all 95 of Luther's points, right? But if the only way you hear it is that's a political group, that's not me. No, I'm not an evangelical group. But if the last 10 times you heard it when you're doing the survey is, oh, you mean those religious voters who think that we should be voting primarily on abortion and stuff? That's how I vote. Check. Yeah. So there's been kind of this reciprocal feedback loop. I do think it's a religio-political category in the U.S. I got one from Elizabeth Overman. It says, do the children of Latino immigrant parents born in the U.S. hold religious preference and political opinions that differ from their parents? I know the first one better than the second. Perhaps Dr. Sharp might know the second better than I do. But the first is, in terms of religion, yes, there's more religious switching in every direction. That second, 1.5 second, third, and post generations are going to have higher rates of affiliation with Baptist congregations, Pentecostal congregations, Assembly of God, as well as having no religious affiliation whatsoever. If it's in line with everything else I've seen in immigrant generations, I did grad work on Asian immigrants, and their political preferences differed as well. If it's anything like every other immigrant group, then the answer is yes, but I don't know the specifics in this particular case right now. I want to say there's a liberalizing effect, but I could be wrong. There's an engagement effect for sure. They're also just more likely to vote.
I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of what you meant by the God gap.
Okay. The God gap is this kind of conventional idea that, so the way they articulated it was people who believe in God are going to be more conservative voters than those who don't. And in terms of that as a simple story, I reject it. And I think the evidence doesn't support it well. But that's the God gap, the idea of conflating religiosity with conservatism.
Yeah.
Okay, what else would we like to ask? Oh, we have one in the chat, I think.
Oh, I may have missed this, and I apologize if that's the case. Were you able to see trends in political religious ideology by breaking down Latinx Hispanic populations by age? So in my data, I did not do the analysis about, it's a similar question to the last one about age, but I've seen it done elsewhere. And in terms of religious ideology, there's just more diversity with youth. Of course, that's also being conflated with immigration status, right? Because the first generation that comes here is typically going to be the older, and your children are necessarily younger than you. And so I take that back. So that's for religion. I know that the younger populations are more diverse. Some of them are more secular. Some of them are religious, but not as Catholic, right? They're in other traditions. In terms of politics, well, it's not pulled up anymore. But in my earliest charts, I did see that younger Hispanic voters were a bit more liberal. But once you control for everything out, that effect washes out. So you could say that younger voters are more likely to younger Hispanic voters are less likely to support Trump, but it's not clear that there's a specific age effect, if that makes sense. Sometimes these relationships are spurious, right? The one I give my students is ice cream sales are positively correlated with murder, but sorry, that got grim. But I think I'm frozen too. I apologize. Oh no, we're good. Good question. I love the way you're thinking age pathway stuff. Very, very good questions.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Vaughan, for an outstanding presentation. You've given us much to think about. Very timely and topical, especially as we approach an election day in less than a week's time. We had a great time talking with you. I would encourage everyone to join us again in 2 weeks from today at 3:30 p.m. when Zachary Scalzo, our creative writing artist in residence, a playwright and translator, will be offering a reading and discussion entitled Letting the Tornado In. That will be on Zoom as well. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Vaughan for this great presentation. Have a great afternoon, everyone.